All right, today we're going to discuss the Supreme Court decision regarding abortion rights, and the repudiation of Roe versus Wade. This Supreme Court, 6 out of the 9 justices voted to invalidate Roe versus Wade. And so we're going to discuss what Roe versus Wade is, upon what grounds that 6 of the justices decided it was worthy of being invalidated, and we're going to discuss the counter-arguments given by the remaining 3 justices, and we're going to zoom in to see exactly what this is all about. So first of all, Roe versus Wade was basically a decision about 50 years ago taken by the Supreme Court to address abortion and the right to abortion. And they basically, I guess you could say, from the perspective of the judicial system, they unilaterally accepted the right to abortion as falling within the 14th Amendment under the definition of liberty and privacy. So the Constitution is not clear about what liberty means, and so the judicial Supreme Court, they decided that it was within their purview to make judgments as to what liberty means. The courts are supposed to interpret the law, and the Constitution is the law of the land, and so when the Constitution gives us liberty, the courts have to figure out what exactly does that mean. And so Roe versus Wade said that liberty means women have a right to abortion. So that was what the fundamental issue in this Supreme Court decision was, whether or not Roe versus Wade presented a good argument. So, in the main thrust of this Supreme Court decision, the recent decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the 6 of the justices, they outlined in about 100 pages why they thought Roe versus Wade was invalid. And the main thrust of their argument was about twofold. The principle of arrogation and basically like an argument from history. So arrogation is just a fancy word for saying the government seizing something from the people. And in this context, what arrogation means is the Supreme Court seized the powers from the state. It seized governing power from the state. So normally, if the Constitution doesn't specify something, the states have the legal authority to preside and to make pronouncements over non-constitutional issues. And so abortion, in this decision, the current Supreme Court justices are arguing that abortion it's not mentioned in the Constitution. They disagree with the idea that liberty includes the idea of abortion. And so the Constitution mentions liberty, the Constitution does not mention abortion. So for the courts to basically validate abortion, they are seizing that right to regulate abortion away from the states. They stole the power of the states to regulate. And so the Supreme Court is saying it wasn't justified for this. The Roe versus Wade was not justified in taking away the rights of the states to legislate over non-constitutional issues. That was the first main thrust of their argument. And the second main thrust was history, argument from history. Basically, they were saying that if the Supreme Court is going to support certain rights, those rights need to be grounded in history, in tradition, in public opinion going back for generations. So basically, it's a very conservative principle, right? If you're looking at conservatism versus progressivism in a very generic philosophical sense, conservatism is saying, let's look at the past and let's conserve what we had in the past. And progressivism is saying, we want to depart from the past and we want to progress towards new stuff, new culture, new values, new rights, etc. So this argument from history is fundamentally a conservative argument, because what they're saying is, we want to look at the past, we want to see what did people value in the past, what was the collective opinion in the past, and whatever the collective opinion in the past was, that is the basis for determining if something is a right or not. And so the Supreme Court, the 6 justices, in order to substantiate their argument from history, they basically ran through a lot of different sources, basically stating that during the 1800s, abortion was largely unpopular. Abortion was illegal in the vast majority of the states. And so they basically feel justified in saying that there can be no right to abortion if the collective opinion is not largely in favor of it. And they limited their scope to the 1800s for some reason. And they didn't seem to try very hard to find counter-arguments to their historical position. So the arguments in favor of Roe versus Wade, 3 of the justices put together a large sequence of rebuttals, and kind of the main thrust of this, they believe Roe versus Wade was valid, they think change is not justified, and they think overruling Roe is harmful. So they think Roe versus Wade is justified because the main idea is that the court needs to explain what the Constitution means. It's a valid role. The Supreme Court has a valid role of interpreting these types of things. The change is not justified because precedent should not be changed arbitrarily. We've had 50 years of Roe versus Wade, and if there's nothing changing in the culture, if there's no disaster, if there's no population decline, if there's nothing extreme going on, if everything is peaceful, there's no justification for changing the precedent. And overruling Roe is harmful. There's a lot of consequences that harm women and families and the nation. So that's kind of the overview. So I put together a list of more details on the different arguments involved, and I think we'll just go through this in a little bit more detail now. So back to the 6 justices, back to why they wanted to invalidate Roe. My summary here, the first principle or argument is arrogation. They believe that Roe, it unduly took authority from the states. The courts were making law instead of interpreting law, so they were not performing their role as justices properly. They were acting like legislatures. So that's one argument. Vagueness is the next argument. They believe that liberty is a vague term, and it's too vague to necessarily include abortion. And so they felt that Roe versus Wade inappropriately took advantage of the vagueness of liberty and included abortion without proper justification. The next argument is history. As we talked about before, Roe assumed that there was a history of tolerance towards the idea of abortion, and this tolerance therefore justified its status as a right. But according to them, the preponderance of historical evidence doesn't support that conclusion, but rather the preponderance of evidence is that the people in the 1800s did not like abortion. The next argument is complexity. Something like abortion is complex enough to make it unwise to mandate at the federal level, and to make it more wise to let the states try to figure it out, to give the states the freedom to experiment and try to figure out what's the best policy on abortion. And the next argument is precedent. Roe versus Wade relied on a couple cases as precedent to justify its opinion. But this court, their opinion is that the cases that Roe cited were not valid cases for the purpose of justifying abortion, because the cases that were cited by Roe versus Wade did not mention killing a potential life. And so killing a potential life is a distinct enough category to not be a proper deduction from other cases. For maybe a certain court case used the 14th Amendment and it interpreted the term liberty in such a way that it justified the courts granting people a right to marriage, right? So maybe in a certain court case, liberty can be interpreted as a right to marriage, but a right to marriage doesn't involve killing anyone. So you can't use the right to marriage and say, oh, we also have the right to kill people. This court was saying that does not follow. Roe versus Wade was incorrect in thinking that those court cases could justify killing a life. So that's the precedent argument. Next argument is broadness. The Roe versus Wade interpretation was too broad. Basically, the word liberty, if you define it or too broadly, if you interpret liberty in a very broad liberal manner, you could include almost anything under that umbrella. Almost anything could be stuffed into the definition of liberty. It could include the right to do bad things, for example, the right to drug use, the right to prostitution, etc., etc. So too broad is one argument. And the next argument is arbitrariness. Roe's emphasis on the viability of the fetus was too arbitrary. So basically, Roe versus Wade, they kind of built a legal framework inside of their ruling, where Roe versus Wade, it identified trimesters, and it said during the first trimester, women have a right to abortion. During the third trimester, states have the power to regulate, and then the second trimester, there's a little bit of gray area. So Roe versus Wade created a legal framework where sometimes the states have power to regulate, and sometimes the women have inalienable rights that the states can't touch. And so there was this balance, and viability was one of the principles that Roe versus Wade appealed to in defining these terms, where the viability of the fetus justified a switch to a different legal strategy. And this court decided that viability was an arbitrary thing, and they thought it was foolish they thought it was foolish for Roe versus Wade to have the audacity to develop a legal framework for abortion, because that's not their job to be legislators. And the next principle is implementability. Roe's undue burden principle is too ambiguous to implement. Basically, the legal structure that Roe outlined contained a lot of ambiguity, and they thought it wasn't they're not good for that reason. All right, so now getting to the arguments, the dissenting opinion, the three justices that rejected the conclusion of the six, the majority. These justices were speaking out in favor of Roe versus Wade, and they thought that Roe versus Wade was valid because it was trying to achieve a balance. There was a balance between states' rights and women's rights, where the trimester structure gave women rights at certain times and gave states rights at different times. They thought that was a fair implementation of a court decision. They also thought Roe was correct in trying to find a balance between conflicting values. There's a value of life, there's a value of liberty and equality, and when these things are contradicting each other in complex situations, they thought it was appropriate for Roe versus Wade to attempt to find a balance between these issues. And the next reason in support of Roe versus Wade was the fact that we need rights. We need the court to uphold our rights, and we need them to validate our rights. And if the Constitution gives us rights, those rights need to be interpreted properly so that we have all the rights that we should have. And certain rights should transcend majority rule at the state level. There are certain rights that should be universal, and it's not appropriate to send all of the authority for rights to the states, because that gives the states the power to invalidate rights that should be universal. So it is the job of the Supreme Court to safeguard those things that should be universal rights. And the next principle was stare decisis. And this principle is basically the idea that the court ought to uphold the precedent. The court ought to support prior decisions. The court ought to accept prior legal decisions as the basis for which to make future decisions, and to not renege, to not violate, to not go against, to not undermine, and to not invalidate court decisions that came before it, unless there's a really good reason. And the thing about Roe versus Wade that's special is that it was reaffirmed. It's one thing for the Supreme Court to make a decision, and then if there's some problems, maybe the future Supreme Court will reverse it because it didn't do that great of a job over time. But 20 years after Roe versus Wade, there was another court case called Casey, and in Casey, the Supreme Court reviewed Roe versus Wade. They reviewed the precedent, they legally thought it through a second time after 2 decades, and they reaffirmed Roe versus Wade. They supported it a second time, making it a doubly confirmed precedent. And so the three justices are saying it's not correct to throw away 50 years of precedent, especially when this is reaffirmed precedent that's working well, at least in their opinion. And the next principle was the unjustified nature of overturning Roe versus Wade. And they outline 3 principles that should be met if you want to violate the principle of stare decisis. If you want to violate precedent, there needs to be a change in legal doctrine that would undermine or make obsolete the earlier decision. So I guess that would mean new laws. If there's some specific changes in the law, maybe we have to undo an interpretation of the law. The second principle is a factual change that had the same effect. So I guess this would be something like a change in society that caused the old decision to become obsolete, to become problematic. The third criteria is the absence of reliance. So the absence of reliance is basically if the Supreme Court makes a decision, but it's not really useful, nobody is using it, nobody is appealing to it, if it never gets referenced or reaffirmed, it's kind of a useless ruling. Maybe it can get redacted, or it can be overturned. And so what these three justices are saying is that none of these criteria have been met in order to justify overturning Roe versus Wade. There's no new legal system that invalidates Roe. There's no factual changes that make Roe problematic, and there's no absence of reliance. We have, in fact, the opposite. Casey relied on Roe, and women rely on Roe in their daily lives, and so that's why it's not justified. And the next argument is about contradictions. So the 14th Amendment was broad enough for lots of different things, right? The 14th Amendment granted liberty, and within liberty, a lot of different rights were interpreted out of that amendment. For example, the right to marriage. But if the 14th Amendment is broad enough to give us lots of rights, including the right to marriage, why isn't it broad enough for the right to abortion? So they basically flipped the argument upside down. The next argument is vagueness is a feature, right? So the six justices were saying vagueness is a problem. The vagueness of the word liberty is a problem. These justices are saying the vagueness of the word liberty is a good thing. The authors of the Constitution were deliberately vague for the purpose of allowing us to be more flexible in the development of our rights. The more specific in the wording of the amendments, maybe there's less wiggle room. By being vague, it helped let us expand those amendments to give us the most amount of rights, which could be argued to be a good thing. The next argument was something to the effect of sexism. They talk about how women were not involved in the creation of the 14th Amendment. Women were second-class citizens during the beginning of the nation. Women didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have the right to own property. So basically what they're saying is it's not surprising that the Constitution didn't explicitly talk about women's rights. The fact that the Constitution doesn't include the right to abortion, it's not surprising considering the state of the culture back then. They weren't really focused on women, perhaps, is the argument. The next principle is dignity. The right to control how one raises a family is an aspect of personhood, and the only way to have dignity is to be able to maintain your personhood. So to control how you raise a family, how many kids you're going to have, your reproductive organs, forced sterilization is a violation of dignity because you just violated their ability to raise a family, right? So if the government is getting inside your bedroom, that violates your dignity. So that's that argument. The next argument is that it was not arbitrary. Specifically, the concept of viability was not arbitrary because the principle of viability means that the fetus, once it's viable, it can live outside the womb. Like, it's a functional distinction. There is a functional line where before viability, it cannot function outside the womb. After viability, it can function outside the womb. So they view that as a valid threshold for building their legal framework of trimester application of law. The next argument was implementability. So the six justices were saying Roe versus Wade was too vague and arbitrary to implement properly, and these three justices are just flat out refuting that. There's nothing wrong with Roe. It's been working for 50 years. All right, the next set of arguments is relating to the harm caused by overruling Roe versus Wade. First of all, just the principle of tyranny. By overturning Roe versus Wade, it gives all the power for abortion back to the states. The states now have the power to tyrannize women. It's greenlighting even total abortion bans. No abortion is safe now. They can do whatever they want with regards to women's reproductive decisions. So just a very expansive amount of power given to the states, and less power from the people. The next argument was the regressive nature. Specifically, the argument from history, the argument that only historically accepted values can be converted into valid rights. If you take this argument seriously, this would apply to slavery, gay marriage, etc. Any new rights, right? Any new rights could be invalidated because history was regressive. Because in the past, in the past, the public opinion was that gays don't have rights. And so if you're looking to history for opinions about gay rights, obviously your conclusion is going to be, people in the past were homophobic, so we should be homophobic. People in the past had slaves, therefore we should have slaves, right? The right to not be a slave, it could be overturned on the same logic. As theoretically, it depends on how you interpret it. So very regressive to appeal to history, since history was not very good at ensuring universal rights. The next argument is warring states. Basically, overturning Roe will cause each state to fight with each other over conflicting laws. Example, traveling abortions. Can a girl in Texas travel to Colorado to get an abortion? Yes or no? Maybe there's going to be a legal battle there. Mailing abortion medication. Can a Colorado business mail or ship medication into Texas? What about that? And then these warring states, if their laws conflict, maybe they're going to have to appeal to the Supreme Court to solve their conflicts. And so that leads into the next argument, which is this decision on abortion overturning Roe versus Wade, but they gave nothing to replace Roe versus Wade with. They replaced Roe versus Wade with nothing, and therefore the abortion issue remains unresolved. We have no abortion guidance. We have no guidance on how the states are supposed to manage this, how the states are supposed to manage interstate conflicts. It basically is just devolving us into legal chaos. The next argument is regarding unity and basically cultural disagreement, which means within our culture there are factions that think abortion is justified and factions that think abortion is unjustified. And this cultural disagreement is a valid reason to adhere to the precedent to maintain social order. So we've had Roe versus Wade for 50 years. Yes, people are fighting over this issue, but we should stick to the precedent as a matter of principle to keep everyone on the same page until we can perhaps unify on a better perspective to replace it with. The next argument is progress. The global trend is towards allowing abortion and America reverting towards the past and reversing the right to abortion. These three justices believe that decision is on the wrong side of history. If we want to be on the right side of history, we need to be progressing towards more rights, not less rights. That's basically the gist of that argument. I believe the conservative former Prime Minister of Great Britain, even he mentioned publicly that he thought that America was regressing and that they were on the wrong side of history. So there's that. The next argument is that consequences are ignored. This decision doesn't address consequences at all, doesn't act like it cares about consequences at all. And from a philosophic standpoint, what this communicates to me loud and clear is our Supreme Court justices, their brains are governed by deontology. There's not a drop of utilitarianism in their brains. To me, that's a problem. That's a big problem. I think my personal opinion, you can read on my, I made a sequence of blog articles on morality. I think moral synthesism is the best way to handle morality. And what I mean by moral synthesism is we need to synthesize different perspectives on morality in a coherent way. For example, deontology and utilitarianism need to be mixed together in order to make a superior morality. And to only have one or the other creates a less nuanced morality that's less effective at securing well-being, for example. So the fact that consequences were ignored, it means deontology is in charge of the court system, and deontology is not very nuanced. And so the following set of arguments detail out the types of consequences that are being ignored. Extreme cases. There's absolutely no protection on women in extreme cases. No protection if the life of the woman's in danger. No protection on rape. No protection on incest. No protection on fetal defects. Nada. Zilch. The next argument is physical consequences. Death of the mother, health of the fetus. It's basically the same thing as extreme cases, except some are lower tier physical consequences. The health of the mother is permanently impacted by pregnancies. It's not just death. It's damage to the body, etc. And there's also rare instances of permanent psychological damage as well. There's a lot. Pregnancy is a really hard thing on mothers' bodies, and it's very negligent of the Supreme Court to just completely brush that off. But I guess they trust the states. They trust the states to think about it. So we'll see how the states do. Financial consequences, healthcare costs are being forced on women. There's, unfortunately, a society will have pregnancy discrimination. The more capitalistic and free market a economy is, the less companies are going to value a pregnant woman who is maybe not performing as well, right? They're going to terminate the employment of a pregnant mother because they can. And lost work due to, the stress of bearing a child is a lot of financial consequences. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The financial consequences are short-term and long-term, loss of education, loss of career advancement. There's tons of consequences. Regressive impact. This to me, this is an important one. Poor women will suffer the most. The statistics, I forget the exact number, but the statistics, my impression of the statistics is that the vast amount, or I'm not sure if it's the vast majority, but a very significant quantity of abortions are the very poor, like the lower class. The women with the least resources are the ones who rely on abortion the most. And so the regressive impact is that overturning Roe versus Wade is hurting the poor more than it's hurting the rich. The rich might be able to find loopholes. They might be able to travel out of state. The poor are just going to have a harder time with everything. Harder time getting healthcare, everything. Loss of rights. So freedom, dignity, equality, and the right to life. Women's right to life is no longer guaranteed if they got a fetus. Their right to freedom, no longer guaranteed. Right to dignity, no longer guaranteed. Right to equality, no longer guaranteed. It's quite unfortunate. And reliance. Basically, women rely on Roe versus Wade to plan their futures, and so it's taking away Roe versus Wade just makes women's lives a little bit harder, and they have to replan out and remap their futures. And the last couple of arguments is relating to the idea that change is not justified, or in other words, departing from Roe versus Wade is not justified. And we kind of mentioned that earlier with the principle of stare decisis, but status quo, nothing has changed in a way so as to necessitate this ruling, so as to necessitate the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Everything's been going basically smoothly for 50 years. What's the problem, right? Interdependent. We kind of mentioned this earlier as well. There's the Supreme Court, they produce a lot of different rulings, and all of these prior cases form an interconnected tapestry of human rights and legal precedent. All of them are interconnected because one ruling is based on another ruling, and they connect and weave together, or this ruling justifies this ruling, and that ruling is justified because of... and so because of how interdependent these rulings are, it's kind of like a Jenga tower. If you start taking out blocks from the Jenga tower, eventually the tower will come crashing down. And so by reversing Roe versus Wade, that's plucking out a very large Jenga block, pulling out a foundational right from the tower of rights that we have. And if you can get rid of one right, maybe you can get rid of another, and maybe all of the rights will come crashing down and we'll have no more rights. Obviously, that's an extreme perspective. It's a slippery slope fallacy if you actually believe it. But slippery slopes are not always fallacies. Sometimes one thing does lead to another. There is causation in this universe, and who knows, like maybe the right to marriage could be taken away if conservative Supreme Court justices want to get rid of gay marriage. Maybe this is a stepping stone towards that. They can use this case as precedent to get rid of other rights. It's not impossible. The next argument is bias. The three Supreme Court justices are arguing that as quickly as they could, these 6 conservative Supreme Court justices, they banned Roe versus Wade. They did it as quickly as they could, which is evidence that they dislike Roe versus Wade. They apparently prioritized an attack on Roe versus Wade without justification. And that exposes their bias. It exposes that these Supreme Court justices, they're not acting in good faith. They're acting with some sort of antipathy, some sort of bias that is not it undermines their legitimacy, because the justices are supposed to interpret the law without bias for the people. And if the justices are interpreting the law based on something else and it's not in favor of the people, you gotta wonder, can the people trust the Supreme Court? What happens if the people can't trust the Supreme Court, right? It's not healthy for a democracy. So I guess the next place we can take this discussion is an attempt to try to understand this decision in a cultural context, in a philosophical context, in a religious context, in a psychological context, in a sociological context, right? Like the Supreme Court decision, it comes as an emergent phenomenon of a larger context, right? Society is complex, there's a lot of moving parts, and then somehow out of all these moving parts, a decision to overturn Roe versus Wade appears, right? It emerges out of this chaos. It's like, if we are upset about this or happy about this, it would be useful to understand why, right? Why are these things happening? Because perhaps if it's a good thing, maybe we can encourage more of these things to happen. If it's a bad thing, perhaps we can figure out how to discourage these things from happening if we can dig deeper, right? And with transcendent philosophy, that's what we try to do. In my opinion, that is one of the main functions of philosophy, is to be digging deeper, right? It's to go a level deeper, go more meta, right? Each time you ask a question, that's going deeper, right? So it's like, I believe this. Well, philosophy, the practice of philosophy is, well, why do you believe this, right? Why? That goes a layer deeper. So you say, I believe A because of B. Well, then the philosopher, or the philosophic approach, Socratic approach, oh, because of B. You believe A because of B. Well, why do you believe B, right? And with deductive reasoning, there's a hierarchy of logic where because of B, if B is true, then A is true, right? And so maybe a lot of people are thinking at a superficial level. I know that B is true, and therefore A is true. But the philosopher is always digging deeper. Well, why do you believe B is true? Well, I believe B is true because C is true, right? Going one layer deeper. And then the philosopher can say, hey, well, let's look at some evidence. Maybe C is not true, right? And if you can get to that phase of a discussion, then maybe an epiphany is possible. Maybe someone will say, wow, I never realized that C is not true. Thank you for exploring this with me. Now that I can see C is the foundation of A, and C is not true, therefore B is not justified, and A is not justified, right? So digging deeper potentially has the power to resolve our culture wars, right? If good-faithed individuals can have good faith discussions where they dig into each other's arguments, not trying to belittle each other, but trying to understand, trying to evaluate, trying to expose, right? We're trying to expose our thinking to ourselves so that we can see it more clearly and evaluate it and say, are my thoughts as good as I think they are? Because deep down, I don't think people want to have incorrect thoughts. Like, nobody truly wants incorrect thoughts. And so if people can become exposed, oh crap, I didn't realize the foundation of my beliefs is wrong. Like, that first of all, that's scary. Lots of people don't want to go there because it's scary. It takes a lot of mental effort. It means that they have to rebuild a new worldview. It's like, oh, my foundation is gone. It's like half my brain is built on this foundation. You just took away my foundation. Now I got to go rebuild my brain. I don't know what to do. Right? It's painful. It's hard, but in the long run, it's probably beneficial, right? So that's what we're going to try to do here, and we'll see how well we do. All right. So the framework I have here, I'm not sure if this is the best framework, but this framework resonates with me. It seems useful. So currently I'm using this framework. Maybe a year from now I'll evolve to a different framework, but that's progress. So this framework that I'm using, it has politics at the top of the pyramid, morality at the second layer of the pyramid, values at the third layer, beliefs, and epistemology. And the structure of this pyramid is meant to convey superficiality and juxtaposed against depth, or stratified against depth. Politics being the most superficial opinion, and in a logical hierarchy, it's like the epistemology is at the bottom, where it's like, this is my foundation, this is what I believe to be true, or this is my process for getting to truth. And then my beliefs, these are what I believe to be true because of this process. So the process of truth is the true foundation. Then the beliefs about truth are the second foundation. And then because of these beliefs, you have values. And because of those values, you have morals, and because of those morals, you have politics, or political opinions. But most people, the brain is too complicated, and consciousness is superficial, right? The brain has consciousness, subconscious, and unconscious. And 95% of the stuff the brain is doing is in that unconscious layer. So the brain is like an iceberg, and we can only see the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of calculations, logic, and effort going on behind the scenes. And so often when we're debating at the superficial level of politics, where, for example, in this case, political opinion, abortion should be illegal, right? From the Judeo-Christian perspective, abortion should be illegal. And so someone else could have the opposite opinion, right? Opposite political opinion. I think abortion should be legal. And if all you're doing is just saying, it's politics at this level, it's just an assertion, right? I assert abortion should be illegal. I assert the opposite. And then it's just kind of a battle. And you don't really get anywhere because it's way too superficial. So you have to dig down deeper if you want to actually get progress in having a dialectic and having meaningful change with someone. So morality is one layer deeper. The Judeo-Christian perspective would be something like, I believe abortion is immoral because it violates the fact of life, right? The fact. Life exists as a scientific fact, right? And then the value behind that is, I value the fact of life. The fact that there's electricity going through this body that is important, right? And then a layer deeper. Why do you value the fact of life? Because the Judeo-Christian, they believe the existence of life is infinitely valuable because God created it and God commands us not to kill it. And that infinite value, like the Judeo-Christian religion particularly, it's like, if you disobey God, there's hell. So hell makes it infinitely valuable in the opposite direction, right? If you do it, it will be... So it's infinitely valuable to avoid hell, and therefore it's infinitely valuable to not disrespect life. So Judeo-Christian value system or belief system, it hijacks the reward and punishment system of the brain, right? Classic Pascal's wager. When we make decisions, we often calculate costs versus benefits. We're thinking, should I go buy some ice cream? It's like, well, is it good enough to justify the cost? Simple, like, oh no, this brand of ice cream, I don't like the taste, it's not worth the money, right? But if you inject hell and heaven into the equation, if you say, if you don't buy ice cream, you will go to hell if you don't buy ice cream. Obviously, everyone's going to buy ice cream, even if they don't like the flavor. They'll be eating orange ice cream, and I hate orange-flavored ice cream, but I want to avoid hell, right? It hijacks our calculation system to control our behaviors. And so there's a huge amount of value system warping going on at the belief level, right? This is extremely foundational. This is 4 layers deep in the Judeo-Christian philosophy. And this heaven and hell is completely warping everything above it. Right? Absolutely warping. And then you go a layer deeper. What's your epistemology? Why do you believe that you're going to go to hell if you do an abortion? Why do you believe that there's infinite value in this process of life? In the fact of life, right? Does infinite value even make sense? And the Judeo-Christian perspective might be something to the extent of, truth comes from God because the Bible says so. And my spiritual experience confirms the Bible. The miracles in my life confirm the Bible. I lost my keys, I prayed, I found my keys. Therefore, God is real. Therefore, the Bible is true. Therefore, I'm going to go to hell if I don't support the Bible. Therefore, life is of infinite value. Therefore, and then it filters up the hierarchy, right? And so the problem is, if you have errors at these deep levels, right? If your epistemology is flawed, if you're confused about God, if you're confused about the Bible, if you're confused about miracles, right? If you're confused about your spiritual experiences, if these things are not the way you think they are, right? Maybe a spiritual experience, maybe that was a delusion. You found your keys, maybe that was a coincidence. The Bible says so. Well, maybe the Bible was written by men, not by God, right? There's a lot of maybes. And so if you get that foundation wrong, everything above it is corrupted, right? So that's why this is an important process. So the next perspective we could look at is maybe a humanist perspective. And first of all, to make it clear, I don't represent humanists, I don't represent feminists, I don't represent Judeo-Christian people. These are just my interpretations. So Feel free to disagree with me, but this seems to make sense to me. Political opinion: abortion should be conditionally legal. I think you could argue that from a humanist perspective. Conditionally legal. Why is that? Let's dig a layer deeper. Morality. Abortion is moral if it has a net positive impact on collective well-being, right? Net positive impact on collective well-being. Humanists, they care about humans. They care about the quality of life of humans. They probably care about the quality of life and the fact of life, but they're more inclusive of different value systems like utilitarianism. So in this instance, for the value system beneath their morality, they value the quality of life. To contrast it, the Judeo-Christians value the fact of life. The humanist values the quality of life. And then what is undergirding this value? It's a belief that conscious experience is the main thing that distinguishes the value of life. So it's less about the fact. It's not like, oh, his heart is pumping. He's in a coma. He's suffering in a coma. He's got chronic pain. He's disabled. You know what I mean? His quality of life sucks, but he's got electricity running through his system. Therefore, it's super valuable, right? It's less about that. It's more about the quality. And it's debatable how you want to go about interpreting that, but you could argue that we want to focus on maximizing the number of happy people, not maximizing the number of people that are just alive, right? You could, if it was a trade-off, do you want 7 billion people that are alive and are very happy and alive? Like, do you want 7 billion people with quality of life, or do you want 1 trillion people that are just comatose potatoes, right? Do you value the fact of life, or do you value quality, right? What is the epistemology that underpins this value of sentient conscious experience? Perhaps you could say truth is that which is self-evident via observation. And so it's self-evident to us that we value quality of life. Perhaps it's self-evident to us that we care less about the fact of life than the quality of life, as evinced by this thought experiment. If you the number of people with high quality lives compared to the number of people with low quality lives, which is more valuable to you? There, you've got your answer. Self-evident truth, right? Epistemology. You could kind of run through that type of reasoning for the political opinion. Abortion should be conditionally legal. So the next hierarchy of perspectives is the feminist perspective. The political opinion might be abortion should be legal, unequivocally legal, no exceptions. What's the moral foundation of this? Perhaps restrictions on abortion are immoral because they violate the rights of the mother. Okay, you could have that as a moral value, but what is the deeper value that justifies that moral perspective? The valuing of rights of women, right? Again, to contrast, theoretically, you could value the fact of life, you could value the quality of life, or you could value the rights of women. Perhaps the rights of women trump both of these things. You could argue that. What would be the belief that undergirds that? Believes that women have been systematically victimized in ways that are unjust and violate women's rights. Something like that. Maybe you could go a different way and say that bodily autonomy or dignity, there's different beliefs that might support. There could be multiple beliefs that intertwine and build a foundation for why we value the rights of women. You could even have beliefs about well-being, right? Maybe you have two competing values. You care about the quality of life of women, or you care about quality of life in general, but quality of life, the rights of women, rights are a way to maximize quality of life, and so the value of rights of women is a value that supports valuing the quality of life. And so it takes precedence. The value in the rights of women takes precedence because that is the maximization function for your different value, right? You can have a hierarchy of values, and just this right, the rights of women comes out on top in the hierarchy of values because that's what maximizes your values. So the beliefs that women are struggling and suffering and they need these rights, right? What is the epistemology behind this? Perhaps there's history, evidence in statistics, there's evidence in female narratives, there's the facts of bodily autonomy, there's the facts of pregnancy. It's like there is a fetus that is infringing on the rights of this body, right? You can dig into the science of how that works. So perhaps if if we wanted to have a dialectic between these different conversations, each perspective would be digging into each other's perspective, and you'd be trying to challenge it and try to see if each perspective could be justified at every layer of analysis, right? And you could look for contradictions, like for example, valuing the fact of life. You could throw out a thought experiment like, do you really value the fact of life over quality of life based on the repugnant conclusion, right? There's the popular philosophic dilemma, which we already alluded to, which is if you could play with the population size, do you want to maximize fewer quantity but happier, or do you want larger quantity but unhappier, right? The answer to that question exposes what your values are, and maybe someone has a contradiction in their values, and that contradiction could find resolution. Maybe they need to ponder it, they need to sleep on it. After they resolve that contradiction, maybe that value system will rearrange itself, and then the morality and the politics will alter, right? It's downstream. If you fix or if you alter a value system, everything downstream of that value system is going to get altered. And so finding a contradiction at a deeper layer, if people can resolve that conflict, that might create change. And one thing I want to kind of highlight a bit is the difference between deontology and utilitarianism. The Judeo-Christian perspective and the feminist perspective, they both are deontological in nature. And what I mean by that is they're rule-based, duty-based, they are rigid, they're not focused on costs versus benefits, they're not focused on consequences, they're focused on a maxim. This maxim is king. This maxim takes priority. Like, no ifs, no buts, no exceptions. So the Judeo-Christian perspective is basically, we deontologically value the fact of life. No ifs, ands, or buts. 20% of Americans don't care if the health of the mother is in danger, don't care if the mother was raped. 25% don't care if the mother was raped. Because that it's the consequence, it's the ends don't justify the means. That's a deontological perspective. The ends is the consequence. So perhaps a woman who's raped is going to suffer through pregnancy. She's going to give birth to the rapist child, and the child is going to remind her. It's a constant trauma trigger. It's a lot of suffering, arguably, but that's a consequence. That's an end. And then perhaps abortion is a means. It's a tool to alter this consequence, right? We want to have a different consequence. Our end is to have less suffering for the mother, right? And so abortion is a means to less suffering for the mother. Deontologists, they don't care about that. They don't care about consequences. Screw the consequences. We just care about the fact of life. Now that your womb has a life in it, we don't care about your psychological suffering. That life is important. Transcendently important, in that its importance transcends all of your importance, right? That's a pretty extreme position. In general, I view deontology as kind of extreme. Most extreme political positions, to me, seem to be deontological. So that's kind of a warning sign, in my opinion, that you might be on the wrong track. Like I said before, moralistic synthesism, I think, is the way to go. How do we balance out our moralities? And if you've only got one morality, just deontology, not very balanced. And I think this principle applies to a lot of political issues. In the future, I want to talk about veganism, because I think veganism goes off the deep end in the same way. Veganism is philosophically a slippery slope to antinatalism because of deontology. And I think if you balance out the deontology with utilitarianism, it resolves veganism and antinatalism. But that's a different issue. So let's just go over to the feminist perspective, valuing the rights of women, right? The rights are essentially a deontological principle, right? A right is basically the idea that society has a duty to not interfere with my rights, right? If I have a right to marry, everyone has a duty to not stop me from getting married. If I have a right to abortion, society has a duty to not interfere, right? So that means that everyone has a rule. Everyone in society has a rule to keep away, to back off, right? Rights are just duties and rules applied to other people. It's everyone else's responsibility to respect your rights. And that's just a flat out rule. It's a maxim. There's no nuance, at least at the superficial level. So this type of perspective, obviously feminism, there could be multiple different feminist perspectives. This is just one rigid perspective. Valuing the rights. Theoretically, you could value the rights of women over and above any consequence, right? So let's say, for example, science drilled down into the psyche of the fetus, right? Inside the psyche of the fetus, and they tested the consciousness. And, there's different neurotransmitters. That dopamine is usually associated with pleasure. Serotonin, I think, is associated with relaxation. Well, there's the P substance, I believe, which is associated with pain. It's a very large neurotransmitter. The P substance, perhaps they can calculate, or they can measure, they can scan, and maybe they look inside the fetus and they say, oh my goodness, look what we found. Fetuses experience more pain than adults, right? You could theoretically make a scientific argument that fetuses are hurt way more than other people. And so when you kill a fetus, it's way more painful than killing an adult. Theoretically, that's a possibility. What does that mean? If you care about well-being, if you care about the reduction of suffering, that makes abortion on sticky ground, right? The consequence of abortion is a lot of suffering for the fetus. That's, for a utilitarian perspective, that's not acceptable. But if you have a deontological perspective, if the rights of the women trump everything, then that means screw the consequences. We don't care if the fetus suffers. We don't care what consequences are going to go on. The rights of the fetus do not trump the rights of the women, and therefore abortion is always justified, right? You could take that position. It's a little extreme, but you could take it. But I think the humanist perspective, at least in this analysis, the humanist perspective, it does the best job at balancing different values, right? And the Supreme Court, they mentioned that they were trying to balance their different value systems. I pretty much agree with that as a philosophic goal, right? So there's the rights of the mother, there's the fact of life, there's the quality of life. I think all of those things should be mixed and balanced together. And theoretically, the quality of life includes all of those things, right? If the rights of women are disrespected, that affects the quality of women's lives. So the rights of women is inclusive within the umbrella of the quality of life. But also, the suffering of the fetus is also included within the umbrella of the quality of life. And so with this utilitarian humanistic perspective, you can synthesize both perspectives and try to achieve a balance. And that's what Roe versus Wade was kind of getting at. Is Roe versus Wade was saying during the third trimester, when the fetus is getting closer and closer to being equivalent to a baby, maybe we should back off. Maybe the states should have some regulatory power. It's like, that's kind of an iffy situation, right? Maybe the rights of the mother are not, just unilaterally able to violate a third trimester fetus. Maybe there's a priority battle where the rights of the mother are maybe the rights of the fetus are slowly growing, and in the third trimester, maybe the rights of the fetus surpass the rights of the woman. Maybe you could argue that, right, as Roe did. So the utilitarian perspective, it gives you the flexibility to make a nuanced judgment that incorporates multiple stakeholders, and that theoretically that's a good way to go. Now, in the future, I think I'll be doing more videos on abortion because I want to go a little bit deeper. This is a little bit too superficial from a philosophic perspective, but I think this is good enough for now. But I guess to get to the conclusion of this video, I just want to emphasize the fact that this Supreme Court decision, to me, it exposes a lot of deontology, right? Judeo-Christian inspired deontology. And I don't think that's appropriate because it's not appropriate for people to impose their religious values on other people. And it's especially not appropriate for Supreme Court justices to impose their religious values on other people. And, there's a common, pro-life trope, which is, oh, but it's a scientific fact that life starts at birth. Well, to me, that's so superficial. It doesn't go deep at all, and it doesn't understand how rights work. It doesn't understand Hume's guillotine with is-ought. There's so much wrong with that philosophically. It can be summed up simply as the fact of life is not the same as the right to life. The fact of life, the scientific fact that you're appealing to, is an is statement, right? But is statements do not axiomatically imply ought statements, right? Just because something is alive doesn't mean we ought to grant it the right to life. Haha, but this is where the Judeo-Christians inject their religion. We believe that everything that is factually alive deserves the right to life. But no, first of all, that's religion. You can't inject religion into the debate. That's not acceptable. It's not justifiable for you to force your religion on other people. Okay? And you think you're not injecting religion, but it's under the surface. There's a hidden assumption that's religious in nature that all life axiomatically deserves to be granted the right to life by God. Yeah, there's no justification for that. Rights, the ontology of rights, you can't find it. You can't. Okay, there's so many problems. It's very frustrating. What's the difference between an elephant fetus and a human fetus, right? Physically, materialistically, you can't find a scientific difference, right? So it is a scientific fact that human fetuses are alive. It's also a scientific fact that elephant fetuses are alive. But you want to grant the right to life to one, but not the other. Why is that? That's also because of a religious bias. You're injecting spiritual value into the human fetus, and you're not injecting spiritual value into the elephant fetus. So you think that animal life is not sacred because of your religion, which the Bible says it's our prerogative to dominate animals. So it makes sense that animal rights are very low priority. But because of the religion, you're injecting infinite rights into the human fetus. There's no justification for that. There's no scientific justification for that. Like, these pro-lifers need to just stop with my politics are justified by science. Bullcrap. No, you're wrong. Your politics are not justified by science. Absolutely not. It's completely fallacious. It's it's sophistry, right? It's bad, deceptive reasoning. And if you dig deeper, it falls apart real quick. So the Supreme Court should be above this. The Supreme Court should be above sophistry. They should not be injecting their religious values into the court system. And that's what they're doing. And so I don't think this is a good step for our nation. And I hope I feel for all the women who will suffer because of this. I empathize with them. I can imagine all of the complex situations that are going to arise, the legal difficulties that they are going to face, and I don't think it's going to be good for them. And I wish that people could think deeper and try to understand what's truly important. If you get what's truly important wrong, your politics is going to make the world a worse place. And so I think it is the duty of every citizen to dig deeper into their value systems, to question their value systems and say, is this truly the best value system? Is the fact of life truly superior to the quality of life? Right? So I hope that everyone can do that, and I hope that we can evolve our thinking, and that we can have the world can be a better place, that we can have less suffering and more happiness. And so hope that was helpful.